Let's go to our next guest. Stay with us, Nick, if you can. I'd like to bring in Peter Zalmayev, director of the Eurasian Democracy Initiative. If I'm not mistaken, you're in Kyiv. I mean, maybe you can confirm that in your first answer. We're just obviously finding things out as we move along with this fast-moving story. But just first of all, tell us what the theories are that you're hearing and what information you're hearing, if anything, that could supplement perhaps what we've heard up until this point.
Well, I just checked out some of the Telegram channels that are linked to Mr. Prigozhin, and they're reporting that as many as 2 rockets from S-400, which is a air defense system, looks like were shot, were launched at this airplane. And, there's a video posted that corroborates that story, if that is indeed a video of the fall, of the crash of this plane just careening down out of control to the ground. And so that's one theory. There's a lot of also suspicion as to whether this may have been some kind of a staged, operation, allowing Prigozhin to essentially go undercover, disappear. A lot of people who just don't believe, which also speaks volumes about the kind of country that Russia has become under Putin. There's nothing is to be believed, nothing is real. But be that as it may, I think it's still puts an end to these speculations that Prigozhin's attempted coup back at the end of June was orchestrated by Putin himself to sort of smoke out his potential and current critics. I never believed that story. I was only just counting down to Prigozhin's eventual demise, and I was very much with those who suspected that Prigozhin will not live out this year after what he did, after this sort of slap in the face of Vladimir Putin, after exposing Putin for what essentially he is, an emperor with no clothes. If you remember, Prigozhin, during his march, people in Rostov, the city he captured within hours, applauded Wagner. No one stood up to defend Putin. Elites in Moscow fled immediately. This is an incredible humiliation for Putin, and it was very risky for him to let this go.
I'd like to just ask Doug, who's here with me in the studio, to pick up on one of the points you made there. Because I remember at the time, 2 months ago during that coup, there was all this speculation that aborted mutiny was part of a broader plan. It was part of a bigger idea of somehow it was a master plan, and this was just a sort of a smoke screen. I mean, how widely held was that opinion?
Well, no, I mean, as we just heard, Russia, the information environment in Russia today is such that, everything is true and nothing is true, and Russians themselves will be the first ones not to believe anything that they hear. The official propaganda, obviously there's harsh penalties right now for publicly speaking out against it or publicly questioning whatever the Kremlin line of the moment might be. The obviously seminal line being that this is simply a special military operation, not a war against Ukraine to snuff out a Nazi regime and demilitarize it, and a hostile country that was about to threaten Russia's national security interests. They've almost become numb to this type of information, and the numbness has sort of segued into a cynicism, which is just rife everywhere you look. I think in the case of what's remarkable in Prigozhin's case, as we just heard, is I think he himself probably thought that he was, his days were perhaps numbered, which is why perhaps one of the reasons why he might have seemingly become even ever more audacious. He was already, known for spewing vulgarities, his extremely coarse language in the audio videos more recently also that he had posted to Telegram and other social media platforms. His language, it was audacious to a point that he was, the only one literally in Russia at that point who dared to say these types of things against the Kremlin. Sure, in the early days after the invasion, we did see protests. We saw people actually taking to the streets. It seems like another era now when you were actually able to still hold public protests against this war, this invasion of Ukraine. Those days are long since gone. Yevgeny Prigozhin simply, in the absence of that, filled the vacuum and was like a one-man band, saying the things that perhaps tens or even hundreds of thousands of other Russians were thinking but couldn't say. And he was saying it more bluntly than you could ever imagine. His Russian language was extremely coarse. And as we just heard, there's a limit to it. Putin has been in his power consolidation mode. He has been trying to, nothing to see here, move on. We heard, yes, the General Surovikin, this happens to come on the same day that he was sidelined, finally dismissed after a lot of speculation over his fate. Was he under house arrest? What had happened to him? Had he just simply disappeared? So all of this is part of a broader thread, if you will, a broader pattern of Putin at the top, consolidating control and sending a message, at least a message that will be construed by most Russians. You don't cross the Kremlin. You don't cross me. Ultimately, he is in control, and he is the one who still, for better or for worse, calls the shots. So this is going to perhaps put a damper on anyone who perhaps would have been inclined, if there's anyone still out there so inclined, to follow up Prigozhin and do a Prigozhin act here. Because, we've seen journalists thrown into jail. We've seen prominent journalists sentenced to 25 years, and locked away. Obviously, Navalny's still in jail. So the prominent opposition figures have been sort of, sideline removed from the scene. And you only had Yevgeny Prigozhin out there for now. And it really was stunning to most of the world looking on. How does this guy do it? How does he get away with it? What is his special magic equation? Is he in cahoots with Putin? What's going on here? Well, for a lot of Russians, they're going to say tonight, especially those of a more cynical bent, are going to say, well, they have their answer. How does he get away with it? He doesn't.
Mm-hmm. Let's bring in Emmanuelle Chaze, our correspondent, who's live for us in the Ukrainian capital, Kyiv. I'm just wondering, Emmanuelle, what's been the reaction there? Presumably, Prigozhin, who was a man who was, I'm assuming, profoundly despised by Ukrainian people. How are they reacting to this news?
Well, despised would be the mild way to put it. Yevgeny Prigozhin here is absolutely hated by Ukrainians because they've witnessed what the head of the Wagner mercenaries did to their country for over a year. Let's remember that Yevgeny Prigozhin was the man who brought Wagner mercenary troops, its troops, to Bakhmut, which transformed it into dust. And the cruelty of the Wagner mercenaries is something that every Ukrainian is aware of, be it because they've seen the horrible pictures of the massacres perpetrated by the mercenaries, or because, like a lot of people here in the country, they have a friend, they have a relative who has endured the brutality of those mercenaries. So there will certainly be no commiseration here in Ukraine for the death of Yevgeny Prigozhin, if that death is indeed confirmed. But here the media is being very cautious when reporting on it. It quotes the Russian sources, but before people here really believe it, they will need more confirmation than just Russian sources. What's to be noted is that there was a reaction exclusively for France 24 from one of the spokesperson of the territorial defense, Sergeant Sarah Ashton-Kirillo, who said, well, if indeed this death is confirmed, then this will be no loss for freedom. And if indeed he is gone, he is certainly now paying for his sins, which is actually a reference to the crimes I've mentioned earlier, where Russian Wagner mercenaries, killed, torture the civilian population, especially in the east of the country, but not only, because those mercenaries were roaming around the country up until June, up until there was that rebellion that Prigozhin orchestrated in Russia. And we've seen here in Ukraine a strong reaction during this rebellion end of June. Ukrainians rejoiced to see internal turmoil in Russia, but this didn't make them, consider Yevgeny Prigozhin in any other way that they did before. You've mentioned spite, but there's also a lot of hatred towards the head of the Wagner mercenaries here in Ukraine.
Thanks for that, Emmanuelle. We'll come back to you in just a moment. I'd like to just go back to our former Moscow correspondent, Nick Holdsworth, who's standing by for us. Nick, just tell us a little bit more about Prigozhin. I mean, he had an extremely colourful life, and, I just wondered what level of popularity he enjoyed amongst the Russian people. What did ordinary Russians think of him?
certainly during the 24 hours of that coup attempt back in late June, when his forces entered Rostov-on-Don, the southern Russian city, which was the major headquarters for the Russian army for the war in Ukraine, people welcomed him like a folk hero. Prigozhin speaks the language of the ordinary Russian muzhik, the ordinary guy. He uses swear words freely, mat, as it's known in Russia, which is really heavy swearing. And he was cheered and applauded by people in Rostov-on-Don. It's worthwhile noting that Rostov-on-Don has a particular character. It's a city with a great deal of pride as a regional capital. It's for a very long time been a major base for crime groups. Regional crime groups are very strong there, have major political influence. And the fact that Prigozhin could enter that city without a shot being fired speaks volumes about, A, the degree to which the Russian military acceded to what he was doing. And we've seen that with the arrest and subsequent dismissal today of General Surovikin as head of the aerospace forces. He was implicated from the word go. And also, he wouldn't have been able to enter Rostov-on-Don without the say-so of the local criminal bosses, the crime bosses. And the people there feel very much that Moscow is somewhere else, and that anything that is a poke in the eye for Moscow is all right with them. So he was very, very popular in that part of Russia. And I suspect across Russia, the fact that he was sticking up for the ordinary grunts, the soldiers who are out there in Ukraine, as the Russians see it, doing their job, serving their country, but not getting enough ammunition, not getting enough support from the Russian military. Basically, he was claiming that his Wagner troops are being treated like dirt and treated as cannon fodder, showing piles of corpses on his private channel, which is seen by a lot of Russians. That would have resonated with ordinary Russians who, of course, have their own very human concerns for men sent to a war where they may not come back from. Not getting into the politics of this, but the Russians would have felt that he was very much on their side. And the fact that he possibly has died today, disappeared, whatever, we're not sure, in this air crash, will have a big impact in Russia. And it remains to be seen also whether Prigozhin has left some kind of time bomb for Vladimir Putin. It's said that he had an awful lot of dirt on Putin. He's known him a long time. He's worked very closely with him. The two used to be friends. It's quite possible that he's left instructions for information to be revealed after his death. And that is something which had been heavily rumoured in the last couple of months when Prigozhin himself was said to have accepted that he may not last beyond the end of the year.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. And I'd like to just cross to Peter Zalmayev and ask, Peter, for your views on what Nick was just saying there, because I think a lot of people will remember that in the aftermath of that aborted mutiny, there were these theories doing the rounds that Prigozhin had this so-called compromat on President Putin. I mean, do you think we should make much of that? I mean, obviously, it's extremely speculative.
I think, yes, it was a bit too speculative to consider that theory that this was a staged operation, like as I mentioned, simply because of what kind of humiliation that it caused to Vladimir Putin. I do believe that Prigozhin may have had compromise on Putin, but I think the largest compromise that we can talk about is the one that he shared with the public pretty openly. Not only did he criticize the war, and very severely, the way it was being prosecuted, the way the military political leadership was corrupt through and through, but he, at the very end, began to criticize the very rationale of this war, saying that it was fought on wrong pretenses. It was, obviously based on fake facts. He took issue with the idea that Ukraine was a Nazi state, etc. He took issue that Ukraine was a threat to the Russian Federation. This was actually coming very close to the Ukrainian and the world's position on this war, how it's been an unprovoked aggression against a sovereign state. And so this is quite ironic, that you began to hear this from Prigozhin. So I would take a little bit of an issue with your Kiev correspondent. I believe that still the person most Ukrainians absolutely hate, despise is Vladimir Putin. Prigozhin was a mixed bag. Prigozhin gained a sort of perverse popularity along with this other fellow, Stilkov, who is now in jail in Russia, who was also instrumental in the war in 2014 in capturing Slavyansk and Donetsk, if you remember. So people actually tuned in to hear Prigozhin on his numerous Telegram channels and on YouTube, because Prigozhin actually a lot of times spoke plain and simple truth. And that explains how a lot of these Russian opposition people in exile, including very, very conspicuously Mr. Khodorkovsky, in fact, supported Prigozhin's attempt at mutiny back in June, which actually caused a lot of controversy, but which tells you that in Russia, where, as we, with the correspondent in the studio have said, nothing is true and everything is possible. That's actually the title of a good friend of mine, a British-based author, Peter Pomerantsev. That is, in fact, what is happening. And that's why hearing Prigozhin, listening to Prigozhin was actually, a breath of fresh air for a lot of Russians, for a lot of Ukrainians, in the environment where you just don't hear the truth from the Russian government and from Vladimir Putin.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, I think this is a recurrent theme, isn't it? That so much mystery surrounded every element of Prigozhin's life. And here we are now speculating as to whether or not he is indeed still alive. Just to bring our viewers up to speed, we know that 8 bodies have been recovered from the crash site about 100 kilometers north of Moscow. We do not know if amongst the 10 passengers on the passenger manifest, Yevgeny Prigozhin was indeed on board. Just because you're on the passenger manifest, it doesn't necessarily mean you're on board. We can only speculate at this stage, but 8 bodies have been recovered. There you can see a map that shows the Tver region, the Tver area just north of Moscow, where that plane went down. 7 passengers, 3 crew. That's 10 people on board, 8 bodies recovered, as we say, at this stage. Doug, turning to you here in the studio, is it fair to say that perhaps since June, Yevgeny Prigozhin has been keeping something of a low profile?
Absolutely no. He has not been keeping a low profile because, you would have thought perhaps under the terms of the agreement that was supposedly brokered by the Belarusian president, Alexander Lukashenko, he was supposed to go into sort of self-imposed exile to Minsk in Belarus, settle down there with those Wagner fighters who were wanted to go with him, those who didn't either choose to join Russia's military forces, the official army, or go home to their families, back into their familial fold. So set up shop there, perhaps, under sort of the umbrella of Lukashenko. And that never seemed to really pan out, at least not under Prigozhin's direction. Instead, we continually got reports of him being cited and flitting about and flying all over the place from St. Petersburg to Moscow to Minsk, back and forth. He certainly had freedom of movement. This did not seem to be a man, at least he was not signaling that he was under any sort of duress or the very opposite of what we heard in the case of this supposedly renegade general who may or may not have supported Prigozhin, Surovikin, the one who was dismissed today formally from his command duties. That general was reported to be under house arrest. We hadn't really seen or heard of him. Prigozhin, just recently we were reporting on there was a summit of African leaders in St. Petersburg, and there were several photos that emerged. Most of them pretty readily verified as being authentic. No reason to believe they were not. Of him on the sidelines of this summit at a fancy hotel owned by his family, his interests, meeting with some of these African officials and leaders, summit leaders on the sidelines. So he was someone who very much remained visible. He was someone who continued, including the most recent one, to put out videos, continued to make it clear that he was very much in play, albeit, yes, he made it clear he was going to be withdrawing from the Ukrainian front, where the Wagner forces were widely credited by most of the with saving face for the Russians in their campaign against Ukraine, especially in Bakhmut. But more recently, basically saying that they were going to concentrate on their African interests. He was prominent throughout Africa, propping up regimes there, also with prominent interests, mining interests there, timber timber interests there, with a lot of questionable activities, to put it mildly, in Africa. But so to answer your question, he was still very much visible. He had not disappeared from the radar. He gave no signs of wanting to disappear from the radar. He still seemed to be a man who perhaps believed he still had a lot of cards in play, a lot of cards to play. And while he may have understood that he was potentially a target, he perhaps maybe thought that he had a little bit of more ammunition, ammunition to continue going, to continue playing, maneuvering, jockeying for position in what had become a real war of wits with Vladimir Putin, even if it wasn't explicitly spelled out as such, neither man really saying, this is my adversary, I'm going to get rid of this person. So it's fascinating to watch. I will just note that Putin himself today was far from the scene of this plane crash. He was in Kursk awarding medals to soldiers on the anniversary of a big World War II battle, the so-called Battle of Kursk in southwest Russia. So he was, seen awarding those medals to soldiers there in Kursk. So he has a prominent alibi for those of the cynical bent wondering, where was Putin today? What was Putin doing? He was there doing his presidential duties, doing his patriotic duties, awarding brave and valorous soldiers war medals on the anniversary of a big World War II battle. So it will be interesting to also see eventually what the Kremlin, the official Kremlin response, which we haven't gotten yet, has been, if not directly from Vladimir Putin, perhaps from his spokesperson, Dmitry Peskov.
Okay, let's go back to Nick Holdsworth, our former Moscow correspondent who's standing by for us. I'm just wondering, Nick, is this story of Yevgeny Prigozhin's possible demise, although we can't confirm that. As I say, bodies have been recovered at the scene, and we don't know if his body is one of the bodies that's been discovered, or it's been recovered, I should say. But is this headline news there in Russia, would you say? Or is, for example, the BRICS summit happening in Johannesburg, which, of course, President Putin isn't at, although he did address it earlier in the day, is that more likely to be dominating the official headlines at any rate?
What I've seen looking at the Russian media in the last hour or so, the Prigozhin story is getting pretty much a high billing. Early in the day, as you've mentioned, there was a lot of coverage of the BRICS summit and Putin's speech blaming the West for the war in Ukraine, saying that it was Western interference which gave rise to the conflict in the Donbass 8 years ago, which has eventually materialized in the war in Ukraine, and Putin is saying that that's the West's fault. Now, he's talking to the BRICS summit. To some people, he's going to get a sympathetic hearing there. That was certainly fairly high up the agenda earlier tonight. This has probably superseded it. I haven't seen the evening news, but certainly on the official wires, on the TASS news agency, it's top billing. You go to TASS and pop, it bangs up before you've even looked at the news site itself. It's there, top billing. I suspect that the Russian authorities will want to play this pretty straight and quell any suspicion in the general public that this is the responsibility of the Kremlin. It will be done with probably some care to ensure that the right message is put across. And I don't doubt that eventually when Putin does comment, Putin will be talking about his condolences to Prigozhin's relatives and about his how he feels sorry for the loss of a man who was once his friend. That's how it is likely to be managed, either directly by Putin himself or by his press spokesman, Dmitry Peskov.
Okay, thanks for that, Nick. Just to bring our viewers up to speed, the latest developments with regards to that plane crash. We understand the US President Joe Biden has now been briefed on that crash. We understand that from the White House. President Biden has been briefed. As we've been saying, we can't say for sure that Yevgeny Prigozhin was on board, even though he was on the list of passengers. And we do know that 8 bodies have been recovered from the crash site. So not 10 bodies, 8 bodies. That's what we know at this stage. Let's go back to Peter Zalmayev, who's standing by for us in Ukraine, in Kyiv. Peter, is there a view there in Ukraine that perhaps Russia wouldn't have managed to make the territorial gains, the few territorial gains it's made, at least in the last year or so, were it not for Yevgeny Prigozhin and his troops in the Wagner in the ranks of Wagner. Is that a widely held view?
Yes, indeed it was, and it has been. Indeed, the one major and the one and only major Russian victory, Russian capture of Ukrainian territory was the city of Bakhmut a few months ago. And that was precisely the Wagner group that was responsible for it. Prigozhin took umbrance, took a lot of offense when the defense ministry took credit for that capture of Bakhmut without giving proper credit to Prigozhin. He was incensed. He said 99% of the credit goes to us. And in fact, Putin backtracked on that decision, on the announcement, and in fact, credited Wagner with that capture. It seems to me that at some point, Vladimir Putin made the calculation that this proliferation of privatized groups, military groups, mind you, other than Wagner, there have been over a dozen other such private groups, including under the purview of the ministry itself, the defense ministry, Gazprom even, the oil giant, the gas giant. In fact, got one of its own, a group such as Wagner. So this privatization of the army, even though it proved in the case of Wagner to be more capable, more efficient than the regular Russian army, it began to threaten Vladimir Putin's authority. Hence, once again, you have this, if that is true, the death of Prigozhin and pretty much the entire Wagner leadership. Mind you, Mr. Utkin was on board, and Utkin, in fact, was the one whose nickname was Wagner. He was the founder of this. That's what Wagner was named after. And this Strelkov-Girkin that I mentioned, Surovikin is now been demoted, who was sympathetic and apparently in cahoots with Prigozhin. So Vladimir Putin really began to fret that this sort of privatization of the army, this dispersal of authority, began to threaten his regime. So yes, this may mean that they're going to have to somehow improve the regular army and continue this fight without Wagner, or maybe try to reconstitute Wagner in some shape or form. And there's also a big question: what happens now with Africa, where Wagner has been very instrumental in keeping some of these governments loyal to Vladimir Putin and allowing Putin to extract, the wealth of these countries. So a lot of unanswered questions. But you know what? As a friend of mine just put it, like in a typical Wagner opera, the end is a lot of people dead.
Yeah, and I'm just wondering, I mean, Wagner post-Prigozhin, if indeed Yevgeny Prigozhin was on board that plane and he has died, I mean, clearly, without Wagner, there is a void in Russia's efforts in Ukraine. And Wagner without Prigozhin leaves Wagner with a void. And I'm just wondering whether, Wagner will continue to exist. I mean, can it continue to exist in the absence of that larger-than-life figure that Yevgeny Prigozhin clearly was?
Well, keep in mind that those people, yes, they may have felt loyalty to that particular man, a very charismatic man, Mr. Prigozhin. Most of them were there for the money. Wagner was the one such unit in the army that was able to pay way above the pay grade of a regular army, Russian army soldier. And so that just won't go anywhere. The number of Russian men who are willing to do it for several $1,000s a month, which is tens of times higher than a regular Russian man's salary in Russia. So I suspect that it's going to be reconstituted. I think they're going to do away with Wagner and with the entire legacy of it. But once again, when it comes to Africa, there's just no great alternative to the way Wagner was doing business. So I expect more of the same, but under a different name.
Thanks for that. We've got a little bit more reaction coming into us here at France 24. U.S. National Security spokesperson Adrian Watson saying, we've seen the reports. If confirmed, nobody should be surprised. So again, a pretty cynical tone being struck by Washington with regards to the death we cannot confirm, the the suspected death of Yevgeny Prigozhin on board that plane. Let's go back to Kyiv and speak to Emmanuelle Chaze, who's standing by for us. Emmanuelle, just tell us, I mean, what kind of news coverage is this story generating there in Ukraine?
Well, as you can imagine, this makes the headlines here because Yevgeny Prigozhin has been such a central character of the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine since last year. He was already known before as the head of the Wagner's mercenary, but since last February, even more so. And also, he is one of the main protagonists in what happened for months during the winter in the eastern city of Bucha. There, the Wagner mercenary troops really conducted very intense fighting. They were feared not just by the Ukrainian soldiers who came under fire, but mostly by the civilians, because the civilians were also bearing the brunt of their assaults, and they were tortured, they were killed. The violence that we saw in the east was unleashed by the Wagner troops first and foremost. So Yevgeny Prigozhin has this image of a very cruel warlord here, and this is why he's not certainly not going to be missed. There's very little sympathy for the person, and there's absolutely no commiseration here for the personality he was. There was one reaction from one of the spokesperson of the Ukrainian territorial defense, who told me a little bit earlier, just as the news of Prigozhin's presumed death broke. She said, well, if indeed this news is confirmed, well, this is going to be no loss for freedom. So that's where Ukrainian stands tonight. This is making, of course, the headlines because of Prigozhin's role in Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And the head of the intelligence, of the Ukrainian intelligence, Kirill Budanov, was commenting on Yevgeny Prigozhin end of June, a week after Prigozhin had started and led a very short-lived rebellion against the Kremlin. Kirill Budanov had said that the Russian intelligence wanted to kill Yevgeny Prigozhin. He announced that on June 30th. So perhaps, if indeed the death of Yevgeny Prigozhin is confirmed tonight or in the coming days, well, this was something that Ukrainian intelligence was aware of.
Okay, thanks a lot for that, Emmanuelle. Another piece of reaction we just got coming into us from the Prime Minister of Estonia, Kaja Kallas, who gave this quote to CNN, again being very cautious in her tone, saying, if true, this shows that the Russian President Vladimir Putin will eliminate opponents, and that scares anyone who's thinking of expressing an opinion that is different from his. So, Doug, who's here with me in the studio, I mean, she's striking a cautious and a cynical tone, isn't she? I mean, like so many other people when it relates to stories of this kind.
But a tone that's based on an objective reading of what has happened to those who have dared to cross the Kremlin, question the official policies of the Kremlin or Vladimir Putin, use language that departs from the official language, and raise any objections or any questions, or seek to get different views about what is happening in the so-called special military operation in Ukraine. This is one more tightening of the noose in Vladimir Putin's consolidation of control after what has been a couple of very turbulent months that have been fraught with and rife with speculation about whether or not he is still really in control. Is he on top of things? Is he calling the shots anymore? Is he now more vulnerable? Is he weaker and weakened? This is clearly something that is going to perhaps strengthen his hand in the sense that people will be less inclined. Anyone who was going to criticize him will be less inclined perhaps to do so. I will note that, what's interesting is the reaction on Russian news organizations. Russia's propaganda outlets, as those that are still based in Russia predominantly are these days, yes, they've been giving sort of a headline, reporting that there's been investigation opened by Russia's civil aviation industry into the crash, reporting basically what we've been reporting, citing all the Russian emergency ministries and all of that. It's been interesting. A few minutes ago, I was just briefly looking at what's on the Russia's first channel, the Первый Kanal, which is the state propaganda outlet, the news channel whose news bulletins are watched still by tens of millions of Russians every night. Often Russians of an older generation, middle-aged and older, who are perhaps not as internet connected and savvy, or just by force of habit, continue to get their news from the propaganda outlets that are state TV. And what they have been showing on First Channel tonight, in the past few minutes at least, are a lot of old archival footage of the Battle of Kursk, which today marks the 80th anniversary of that epic battle, the Soviet Red Army against German forces, and that's what we were talking about a few minutes ago. Putin was in Kursk today, in the Kursk region, handing out medals to soldiers. So that is prominent on tonight's news right now, and also some industrial reports. The Prime Minister was on reading a report about production in Russia right now, reminiscent a lot of this type of coverage of what we used to see of, the hero workers of Soviet labor back in the Soviet days. The coverage very much not reflecting on Russia's perhaps most watched state news channel, the First Channel, not reflecting what you might expect in a country right now where a story of this nature has just occurred with so many questions. The press is giving sort of minimal service, minimal attention to the story, reporting it with a threadbare minimum of reporting of a plane going down, but then moving right on to the next story, not harping on it, not dwelling on it, not asking questions, no sort of investigative reporting or attempts at any sort of debate or talk show. No one right now on the state television is doing sort of what we're doing right now, or a lot of other channels throughout Western news channels are doing, which is trying to do rolling news about this story as new information comes in, as reactions come in, as questions are asked, as theories are bounced about back and forth. That is not happening right now, at least not in official Russian news outlets. There's a lot happening on the Telegram networks. There's a lot of videos being posted. There's a lot of people speculating, as we heard Peter talking about earlier. So there's a real, if you will, split screen bifurcation in the way this story is being covered if we go into the traditional propaganda outlets in Russia versus the non-traditional, but now widely read by a lot, especially younger Russians, who want to get more reliable news, get differing, clashing viewpoints on news on the Telegram channels and on the social media.
Yeah, indeed. And as we've been speaking, more reaction has come in from around the world. Again, the US State Department saying Prigozhin's death comes as no surprise. We've also got reaction from Ukraine. I've just got this cited by the Agence France Presse, the AFP news agency, citing a Ukrainian official. I don't know which official they're referring to, but they say this plane crash is a signal from Putin to Russia's elites. Let me cross to Peter Zalmayev. Peter, I just want to ask for you to help us decode that message that comes from Ukraine. As I said, I don't know who in Ukraine said this, but a Ukrainian official saying this plane crash is a signal from Putin to Russia's elites. What's the message?
Well, this is a clear message, and this is something that has already been mentioned in this segment, and I concur with the previous speakers that it's very simple. You cross the line, you can criticize anyone, but you cross the line by going after Putin and questioning his war, his rationale for going to war with Ukraine. So Prigozhin committed a few cardinal sins. One is by going to Moscow and challenging Vladimir Putin's rule, even though officially he never claimed that he was there to depose Putin, but he humiliated him, as I said. And the other one was that he exposed Vladimir Putin's lies, his lies that he presented as facts and as rationale to go to war with Ukraine. And now war in Ukraine is now a sacred cow for Vladimir Putin. He's trying to mobilize the resources of the entire country and to conduct another massive mobilization, from what we understand, sometime in the coming months before the winter sets in, because now this war is being presented as a war for Russia's existence, as an existential war that Russia simply cannot afford to lose. So everything will be committed to that effort, and anyone who questions that will follow the fate of Prigozhin.
Yes, I mean, we can't expect, can we, there to be any sort of a backlash there in Russia? Because we've talked about how Prigozhin did have this sort of Robin Hood-like folkloric popularity in pockets of the Russian population. Presumably those people who liked him, Peter, they're not going to come out waving placards saying how much they miss him, are they?
That's been demonstrated pretty amply. With Prigozhin's case, after he essentially was made to go away, and after the failure of his coup, despite hundreds of thousands of followers on YouTube and Telegram channels, and the other fellow, Mr. Girkin Stilkov, that former KGB officer who was instrumental in Russia's war effort in the Donbass in 2014, he's now been charged. He's in jail. He had close to 1 million followers in Telegram well after he was arrested. How many of them actually showed up in his defense in person? A few dozen. Russia now is a fully totalitarian police state. I do not see any sort of agency on the part of the Russian population to rise up, to protest. That's been long gone. That's Russia. For as long as Putin is alive, he will not tolerate any degree of dissent.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Peter Zalmayev, Director of the Eurasian Democracy Initiative. Thank you very much indeed to you. We're coming to the end of this segment, Doug. I'd just like to sort of wrap up with some final thoughts from your side. And, as the hour has gone by, how your interpretation of these events has has evolved.
Yeah, well, I've been looking at a lot of the reaction, which we were speaking early on about how Russians are going to construe this, and we heard a little bit from Peter on this about the degree of cynicism in the reliability and the accuracy of news as reported by Russians. Right now, this is officially being reported in Russia on official news outlets as an investigation into a violation of air safety rules. You can interpret that or read into that whatever you want. It's very bland language. It's language that allows for any really interpretation you want. But there's no sort of hard connection. There's nothing that goes beyond the fact that there was basically a plane crash. Bodies were found, and that's all we know. Meanwhile, you have some of the more independent Russian outlets and on social media as well, quoting anonymous government sources and people who didn't want their names to be used for perhaps obvious reasons, given the nature of those who say a negative word against the Kremlin line, basically saying that it would be a miracle if this were actually just a coincidence, just a matter of an air safety
Can I just
accident.
interrupt you for 1 second, Doug? Because actually we've got this great quote from the Polish foreign minister who's saying exactly what you're saying there. We would have great trouble naming anyone who would intuitively think this was a coincidence. It so happens that political opponents whom Vladimir Putin considers a threat to his power do not die naturally.
And that's, this is, you were asking me what my sort of wrap at this early stage in this developing story would be. And it is essentially that, normally our first instinct as journalists, when stories like this happen, you have to be extremely careful, right? You cannot say, we're not saying Yevgeny Prigozhin killed in plane crash. We don't know. We cannot verify and report absolutely 100% that he was on that plane. But what you can do is you can sort of intuitively, based on a lot of precedent, based on a lot of experience, you can form what I might call an objective opinion. And the objective opinion means an opinion based on a lot of facts and precedent in Russia when these types of stories emerge. And it would be a miracle, as I see it at this hour, if this were simply an accident. At this point, and I don't think it's really going out on a speculative limb. I think the reason we're seeing so many of these reactions is it just seems so unlikely that is merely a case of of a plane suddenly free-falling out of the sky. Yes, we've seen it in the past. It's happened to planes. It happened in 2009 with an Air France flight. You'll remember the horrible accidents where it literally fell out of the sky because of a malfunction on the plane. And this was, a jumbo jet carrying a commercial jet. So things like this do happen. Yes, it could have happened. Yes, Yevgeny Prigozhin could still be alive somewhere out there, not on that plane. Chances are not. And chances are that Russians who are cynically looking at this story and reading into it and being a little cynical about it and thinking that it's more than just an accident, probably they're on to something.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Steve, for that. Our international affairs commentator, Doug Herbert, thank you to you. Thanks to our former Moscow correspondent, Nick Holdsworth, and to our Kyiv correspondent, Emmanuelle Chaze. Thank you very much indeed to you. And thanks to you for watching. We'll keep you updated here on France 24.